The night Maeve Sutton used her last $38 to pay a stranger's hospital bill, she had no idea she was handing her money to the most dangerous man in New Orleans. It was a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Tuesdays had a particular kind of cruelty, not dramatic enough to justify falling apart, not hopeful enough to pretend things might turn around. Maeve had been on shift since 6 in the morning, and by the time the clock above the triage desk clicked past 11 at night, her sneakers were soaked through from a spill in Bay 4, her hair had given up entirely, and the fluorescent lights were doing that thing where they hummed just slightly off-pitch, drilling into the back of her skull. She was a second-year nursing student, doing her clinical rotation at Mercy General, which was a polished name for a hospital that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the particular despair of people who couldn't afford to be anywhere else. The emergency department where she worked 3 nights a week was in the basement, which she'd always thought was appropriate. Everything that needed to be hidden ended up underground eventually. She was restocking the supply cart in the hallway near admissions when she heard it, a low, controlled argument at the front desk. Not yelling. That was what made her look up. People who yelled in the ER were usually scared. People who spoke that quietly were usually something else entirely. There were 2 men. The one at the counter was large, wearing a dark jacket that was doing a poor job of hiding the fact that he was soaking wet, one sleeve pushed up past his forearm where someone had wrapped a makeshift bandage that had bled through twice over. The woman at admissions, Patricia, was explaining something to him in the careful tone she reserved for people she was about to turn away. The other man stood slightly behind the first, scanning the room in a way that had nothing to do with curiosity. Maeve didn't make a habit of inserting herself into situations. She was a student. She had no authority, no leverage, and exactly the wrong kind of instincts for someone who wanted a quiet life. She walked over anyway. "What's the problem?" she asked Patricia, keeping her voice neutral. Patricia didn't look relieved to see her. "Mr." She glanced at the counter, where no paperwork had been started. "The gentleman doesn't have his insurance card, and the card he's presented has been declined." Maeve looked at the man. He was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not embarrassment, not anger, something more deliberate than either. He was probably in his mid-40s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now interesting in a more complicated way. The bandage on his arm was bad. She could see the edge of something dark and wet underneath it. "He needs stitches," she said. It wasn't a question. "He needs to sort out his payment, Patricia." Maeve kept her voice low. "He needs stitches tonight or he's going to need a transfusion tomorrow." A silence. The man with the scanning eyes moved almost imperceptibly, and Maeve had the sudden, distinct impression that she had just stepped into a conversation that had been happening on a frequency she couldn't hear. "How much is the intake deposit?" Maeve asked. Patricia hesitated. $35 for uninsured walk-in processing. Maeve reached into the pocket of her scrubs. She kept her tips from the weekend bartending shift she'd been picking up in an envelope in there, cash only, because she didn't trust herself not to spend it if it lived in her bank account. She'd been saving it toward a textbook she needed before the end of the month. She counted out $35 and set it on the counter. "There," she said. "Process him." The man at the counter looked at the money. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible but there, like a door closing very slowly in a room she hadn't known she was standing in. "I don't need your money," he said. His voice was low and even, with the faint trace of something southern in it worn smooth. "You need stitches," Maeve said. "The money is secondary. Miss Sutton. And you're wasting time." He studied her for a long moment, not the way men usually looked at her, which she'd learned to file under ignore and move on. This was different, more careful, like he was reading something written in very small print. "Fine," he said. His name on the intake form, filled out by the quiet man behind him while the first man sat in Bay 2 getting his arm cleaned and stitched, was Leland Cross. She didn't register it at the time. She was focused on the wound. A clean cut, deep, consistent with broken glass rather than a blade. though the distinction felt fragile, and on keeping her hands steady and her face neutral while Dr. Okafor supervised from the doorway with her arms crossed. Leland Cross didn't flinch once. He watched her work with the same focused attention he'd given her at the counter, which was unnerving in a way she decided not to examine too closely. "You're a student," he said. "Yes, you're good." "I know," Maeve said, because she did, and because false modesty seemed like the wrong register for this particular room. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face and disappeared. When it was done, the quiet man, who had given his name as Garrett and said nothing else, moved forward to settle the account. The money Maeve had put down was returned to her in cash, slid across the counter by Patricia with an expression Maeve couldn't interpret. She went back to restocking the supply cart. She didn't see Leland Cross leave. She didn't think about him again until Thursday, when she arrived at her apartment building to find that the lock on the main door had been repaired. It had been broken for 6 weeks. She'd filed 3 maintenance requests. The property management company had responded to none of them. She thought coincidence. She was a practical person. She believed in coincidence. She stopped believing in it 2 days later, when she found out her clinical rotation had been extended by 4 months. A funding arrangement she'd been told was impossible until it suddenly wasn't. And the scholarship committee had, without explanation, reconsidered her application. Maeve sat with that information for a long time. She was not a person who ignored patterns. It was one of her better qualities, and occasionally one of her worst. She'd been good at math before nursing, had the kind of brain that found structure in things, connections in data points that other people treated as separate events. She looked at the broken lock and the funding and the scholarship, and she drew a line between them, and the line went straight back to a Tuesday night in the ER at Mercy General. She didn't tell anyone. She wasn't sure what she would say. The next week she was leaving a late shift when a car pulled to the curb beside her. Dark, quiet, not the kind of car that belonged in this neighborhood without a reason. The window went down. Garrett was driving. "Mr. Cross would like to speak with you," he said. It was not phrased as a question, but it didn't feel like a threat either. More like an announcement of something that had already been decided. Maeve stood on the sidewalk in the November dark and thought about all the very sensible reasons to say no. "Where?" she said. The restaurant was on Magazine Street. The kind of place with no sign outside and a door that looked like it belonged to a private home. Inside it was warm and nearly empty. A few tables occupied by people who gave off the careful stillness of people accustomed to being in rooms where powerful things were discussed quietly. Leland Cross was at a corner table. His arm was in a clean bandage she could see at the cuff of his shirt, and he stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "Miss Sutton," he said. "Mr. Cross." She sat down across from him without being asked. She'd decided in the car that she was going to do this on her own terms or not at all, and her own terms started with not waiting to be invited to sit. He looked at her with that same close attention and said, "You know, I suspect," she said. "There's a difference. What do you suspect? That the lock got fixed and the scholarship got approved because you made calls?" "I suspect that's not something you do for strangers." She paused. "I suspect you're not someone who owes debts." "I'm not," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing words, but the silence of someone deciding how much of the truth to hand over. "Because you put down your last $38 for a man you'd never met and asked for nothing back. That's not common." "It was 35, Maeve said. "And it wasn't. I didn't do it for you specifically. I did it because he needed stitches." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "That's why." She looked back at him. There was something very still at the center of him, the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace but from practice. Like a room that had been emptied of everything breakable. "Who are you?" she asked. The question sat between them. He didn't look away. "Someone who controls a significant portion of what moves in and out of this city," he said, "legally and otherwise." Maeve absorbed that. She was a practical person as previously established. She also had, it turned out, a very high threshold for drama, a useful quality in emergency medicine and apparently also in this. "The man at the counter," she said, "the way Garrett was watching the room, the way you didn't have ID." She paused. "You weren't mugged." "No. Business." "Yes." She looked at her hands on the table. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not going to pretend you don't know what I am," he said, "and I don't enjoy pretending." That was honest, she thought. Or it felt honest, which was not the same thing, and she should probably remember that. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "That's what I wanted you to understand. The lock, the funding, those are returned debts. I don't carry them. Whatever I owe you is paid. You don't owe me anything. You'd be surprised," he said quietly, "how few people do what you did and ask for nothing." They ate dinner. She hadn't planned to, but he'd ordered food and it arrived, and she was hungry in the bone-deep way of someone who'd been running on caffeine and vending machine crackers since 6 that morning, and it seemed unnecessarily dramatic to refuse. He asked about nursing school. He asked about what she'd been doing before. She told him about the music. She'd played violin for 6 years before a hand injury had rerouted her entirely, and she still felt the phantom of it sometimes, the muscle memory of something she couldn't do anymore. He listened without filling the silence with false sympathy, which she appreciated. She asked about New Orleans, not about him, about the city, about what he saw in it that she didn't. He talked about it with the particular knowledge of someone who'd moved through every layer of it, the official and the unofficial, the historic and the hidden. She found herself leaning forward without meaning to. She told herself, walking out to the car he'd sent to take her home, that it was just dinner. A closed account. A debt paid. She almost believed it. 3 weeks later, Maeve was leaving the hospital at midnight when she noticed the man. He was standing across the street in a way that could have been nothing, waiting for a bus, killing time. Except that he'd been there when she arrived at 7, and she had the specific, pre-verbal recognition of being watched that she'd developed over years of night shifts in uncertain neighborhoods. She pulled out her phone. Garrett's number was in there because Leland Cross had given it to her at dinner, with the specific instruction to use it if she needed to, and not to feel obligated if she didn't. She'd put it in her phone and told herself she wouldn't use it. She used it. Garrett arrived in 11 minutes. By then, the man across the street had moved, but not far enough. She saw Garrett's expression shift when he got out of the car and scanned the block. "Come with me," he said. "What is this?" she said. "I don't know yet," he said, which was somehow more alarming than a definitive answer. "But Mr. Cross will want to." She sat in the back of the car and thought about calling her roommate, Bridget, who was sensible and pre-law and would have excellent practical advice about this situation, all of which Maeve was fairly sure she was not going to take. Leland was at a building she hadn't been to before, not the restaurant, not anywhere she could identify. An office or something functioning as one. He was standing when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, and the measured stillness she'd noted before was present, but threaded through with something else now, something tighter. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and then he turned to Garrett and they exchanged something, not words, but some compressed communication she wasn't part of, and Garrett left the room. "This has something to do with you," Maeve said. It wasn't an accusation. She was just accounting for the data. "Yes." He turned back to her. "I'm sorry. This shouldn't have come near you." "Why would it?" she asked. "You said the account was settled. We don't know each other." He was quiet. Then, carefully, "I've been making sure you were all right." Maeve looked at him. "Since the hospital, yes." She sat down on the edge of the nearest chair and took that in. A less practical person might have described what she felt as a complex emotional weather system. She thought of it as, he had been watching. She hadn't consented to that. It had quite possibly kept her safer than she would otherwise have been. And the fact that those 3 things were all simultaneously true was going to require more processing than she had bandwidth for right now. "Is that your job?" she asked. "Or is that something else?" He met her eyes. "Something else." The something else turned out to be a man named Carver Bryn, who had been Leland Cross's financial director for 11 years and had spent the last 3 of them moving money in directions Leland hadn't sanctioned. The man outside the hospital was one of Bryn's people, running reconnaissance. Not specifically on Maeve, it emerged, but on Leland's movements, and Leland had been careful enough that his movements were hard to track, which meant the people around him were easier. Maeve learned this not from Leland directly, but from overheard pieces of conversations in the next 2 days, during which Leland had quietly, without asking her permission, and also without giving her the opportunity to object, installed her in a guest room in a house in the Garden District that she gradually understood belonged to him. She objected on the 3rd morning over coffee she was drinking because it was very good coffee, and objecting could wait until after. "I have classes," she said. "You'll go to classes. I have a roommate who's going to report me missing." I had Garrett call her. "She's been informed you're staying with a family friend." Maeve set down her coffee cup. "You had your driver call my roommate." She seemed satisfied. "Bridget is very easily satisfied by confident-sounding men," Maeve said, which was true and infuriating. "That doesn't mean this is acceptable." Leland Cross looked at her across the kitchen. He had that quality she'd noticed from the beginning. The one that made her feel like he was reading her more carefully than most people bothered to. And this morning it was layered with something that might have been, in a different man, the early stages of something close to discomfort. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. "Tell me the truth," she said. "All of it," he told her. It took the better part of an hour, and she listened without interrupting, and at the end of it she sat for a while with the shape of what she'd just been handed: a city, an organization, a structure of arrangements and agreements and enforced truces that kept a lot of things from happening that would otherwise happen, and also allowed a lot of things to happen that she would prefer not to examine too closely. Carver Bryn, who had decided that the structure needed a different architect and was making moves accordingly. "He's going to come after me to get to you," Maeve said. "Not if I find him first, and if you don't." He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "I can take care of myself," she said. It wasn't bravado. She'd grown up in a part of New Orleans that didn't reward helplessness, and the hand injury had pushed her into a discipline of physical self-reliance that she'd never entirely given up. She ran. She boxed twice a week with a woman named Doris at a gym on Freret Street who was 70 years old and completely merciless, and she'd spent enough late nights walking through uncertain territory to understand the difference between fear and information. Leland Cross looked at her. "I believe you," he said. That was the moment she would think later. Not the dinner, not the car, not the coffee in his kitchen. That moment when he said, "I believe you," with the particular quality of someone who didn't say it easily. Carver Bryn made his move on a Friday. Maeve heard later, pieced together from fragments she wasn't supposed to hear, that Bryn had operated under the assumption that Leland's protection was extensive but not personal, that Maeve Sutton was a loose connection, easily pressured. What Bryn's people hadn't accounted for was that Maeve had walked the block around the Garden District house every morning at 6 for the past 4 days, at Leland's request, and had taken careful note of every vehicle and foot pattern in the neighborhood, because that was the kind of thing nursing school had clarified was not instinct but method, the habit of observation, of noting what was present and what was missing and what had changed. She noticed the change at 6:14 on Friday morning, a truck that had not been there Thursday, a man who moved like he was waiting. She went back inside. She did not panic. She went to the kitchen and she called Garrett and she told him exactly what she'd seen, and she described the truck and the man in the same clinical register she used for describing symptoms. And Garrett said, "Don't open the door," and she said, "I already know that." Leland was there in 20 minutes. What happened in the hour after that, she was only partially witness to. There were raised voices, and then the sound of movement in the street, and then a silence that was different from ordinary silence, the kind that follows when a situation has resolved itself definitively. Carver Bryn, she understood, would not be a problem further. Leland came back in through the kitchen door. He had the look of a man who had expended a significant amount of controlled energy and was now in the process of recalibrating. He stood across the kitchen from her. "You called Garrett before you called me," he said. "Garrett's number was listed first," Maeve said. A pause. "I'll have him moved down." She looked at him. He looked back. The thing that had been building between them in the space of a kitchen and a garden, and a series of late-night conversations she'd told herself, were just logistics. It was there, present and unaddressed. And she was a practical person, and she was tired of treating it like a data point she hadn't collected yet. "I need to know something," she said. "Ask. The monitoring, the lock, the scholarship, the way you've been managing the perimeter of my life since a Tuesday night in November." She held his gaze. "Is that who you are with people, or is that something that's specific to this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Specific," he said. She nodded slowly. Okay, he said, as if she'd answered a question he hadn't asked aloud. In some ways she had. She went back to her clinical rotation. She went back to Doris and the gym on Frere Street, and to the apartment she shared with Bridget, who wanted an unreasonable amount of detail about the family friend she'd been staying with, and eventually extracted a satisfying but incomplete version of the truth. She went back to her life, which was her own, and she intended to keep it that way. She also had dinner with Leland Cross on Thursday evenings, in the restaurant on Magazine Street, in the corner table that was always available when they arrived. She was not naive. She understood what she was adjacent to, what it meant, what it would continue to mean. She'd looked at the shape of it the same way she looked at difficult diagnoses, with clear eyes, without flinching, and with the specific understanding that knowing something precisely was always better than knowing it wrong. He did not pretend. She did not pretend. That was the foundation, and it was sturdier than most. One Thursday in December after dinner he said, "I'd like to know what you want, not what's reasonable, what you actually want." Maeve thought about it. She was not a person who answered quickly when the question was real. "I want to finish my degree," she said. "I want to be good at my job. I want the lock on my building to work." She looked at him. "I want Thursdays." He nodded. Something in him settled, the way she'd watched patients settle when the pain was finally being addressed correctly. "Not gone, but located, manageable. Then you have them," he said. Outside, New Orleans was doing what it always did, humid and loud and lit up in colors that didn't exist anywhere else, layered over something old and complicated and not entirely safe. Inside the restaurant on Magazine Street, in the corner table, Maeve Sutton picked up her coffee cup and thought that of all the things she'd expected from a Tuesday night in November, this was not one of them. She didn't mind. She'd always been better at working with what actually happened than with what she'd planned for. That was the thing about emergency medicine, and apparently also about this. You showed up, you assessed what was in front of you, you did the work without flinching. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the outcome was better than anything you'd thought to hope for.